So welcome back to our three-parter talking about the career of Taylor Sheridan, the acclaimed screenwriter and now director. We already talked about Sicario in the previous video, so go and check that one out if you're interested. However, this is a standalone episode, and today we are talking about Hell or High Water, a film that I honestly adored. I didn't watch it when it came out. I didn't watch it when it just first came out. It wasn't really on my radar in those years. However, having actually seen it recently, it was one of my favorite films that I've watched this year. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I think it's interesting to note because this is a film that he worked on after Sicario, and I think it would have been easy at the time, like going back in time, looking back at it now, you're like, Taylor Sheridan was a great writer. It would have been easy to look back at Sicario and go, Denis Villeneuve really did that movie. And he did. He deserves tons of credit for it. But it would have been easy to be like, well, I don't know if the guy who wrote that is going to like put out a banger like Hell or High Water directly after. I mean, how do you follow Sicario? Yet he did. And while I do love Sicario visually, and I love the way it's directed, but I think I like Hell or High Water just as good. And I might actually have a more visceral, emotional connection to it. I don't know.
I think Hell or High Water is the best of the three.
And it's also the most human.
Yeah, it's a 10 out of 10 movie for me.
Yeah.
Like it's one of the few movies, especially in recent memory, that I just go like that is as close as they get to a perfect movie. Like from the writing to the directing to the acting to the cinematography. It wasn't shot by Roger Deakins, but it's still incredibly well shot.
You don't have Roger Deakins attached. You don't have Denis Villeneuve attached. It would have been easy to expect less. Yeah. Yet we still got something great. I mean, it was directed by David Mackenzie, correct?
Yeah.
Who doesn't have a ton of credits to his name as a director. I mean,
he did the Outlaw King. He's done a few other movies, but I'm not super.
Not a big splash.
No,
I remember it coming out with Chris Pine. I didn't even finish the film.
I'm not super familiar with his filmography.
I don't recall it being anything bad, but I did watch like probably 30 minutes of it and didn't really get hooked on it. I remember clicking on it because it had Chris Pine in it, because who doesn't love Chris Pine? But speaking of Chris Pine, Ben Foster, Chris Pine, and Jeff Bridges absolutely slaughtered this film too.
Yeah.
And we talked about in the previous episode the element of humanity that Taylor Sheridan brings to all of his films, despite them not having to be big, bombastic, supernatural, or even unlikely circumstances. I think that's another interesting thing, is that in his almost all of his films, the circumstances are not particularly unlikely. You know, in Sicario, you know, the drugs and the, the border and the struggles that they're dealing with the U.S. government, et cetera, are real. Mm-hmm. There's nothing really uncommon about them. They might be dramatized, obviously, for a film. Same thing goes back to Hell or High Water. I mean, they were people in these two brothers that are in a situation that's incredibly understandable. Mm-hmm. And very relatable. Obviously, it has that element of it being a film and working together nicely and elevating that tension, but it's very real and understandable. It's very easy to put yourself in Chris Pine's shoes. And it's very easy to sympathize with the struggles of Ben Foster's character.
Yeah. Yeah, and like we were talking about with Sicario, I feel like everything that happens in the movie makes sense from the character's point of view. Like even the fact that it's kind of, I mean, it is a heist movie. It's a cops and robbers heist movie, but none of the heists feel in the least bit unrealistic. Mm-hmm. Like everything that they do, whether it was like I feel like he doesn't leave out the stuff that isn't glamorous. You know, mm-hmm. Like there's sort of like, oh, it's a heist movie. It's supposed to be slick and cool and look like, no, it's like, it's kind of, they're just quick and dirty.
Yeah.
And then afterwards they go dump a car in the dirt. Like
the movie was far, far more about two brothers.
Yeah.
Than it was about anything involving the plot.
Like everything, sort of every genre element of it is almost played down to a degree where it just feels like realistic and mature in the way that it's handled. And like Jeff Bridges, I feel like needs more recognition. Like I feel like he gets a lot of recognition and he's getting good roles lately, but he has always been a great actor and he's just killing it in the last like 10 years, especially.
When it came to his role in this film, I specifically thought while I was watching it, I was like, man, I love seeing him in this mature role.
Yeah.
Like, because he has so much personality, and, you know, obviously he's done kind of comedic roles before and those kind of iconic, goofier roles. But in a role like this, you know, playing pretty much just an old cop is like,
Yeah, he's
He
amazing.
played it. It reminded me. I did feel a lot of parallels to No Country for Old Men,
Yeah.
and the character of the cop in that film to Jeff Bridges role. That being said, while comparing the film to a film like No Country for Old Men, I felt like it was the version of the film that was made for people. Does that make sense? Like Country for Old Men is a really visceral film.
Yeah.
It's a very offbeat film. It's very about situation and performances than it is about characters and like deep characters. And I really enjoyed the depth of character in Hell or High Water. It felt like a lot of those situations grafted into a more realistic setting.
Yeah. Well, I feel like they do such a great job, especially in Hell or High Water, of making toning down genre elements and making them very human and mature, but also not sacrificing any entertainment value.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel like in any way this is an inaccessible movie. It is totally accessible to mass audiences.
Yeah.
And the movie is incredibly well liked among not just critics, but audiences. Like, they are just, I feel like it proves that you don't have to dumb things down for audiences. You can treat them like mature adults.
When it comes to how relatable these characters are, especially, I think it's the strongest among his films with Chris Pine in this film, because you often feel as a viewer like Chris Pine following his crazy brother, his unpredictable brother. And, I think when you're talking about praising the writing, it would be easy to write a film with similar characters and similar plot and it not be so gripping. No. But it's really the conflict between them and how well that it's handled that really makes it stand out above the rest, because there's nothing unique about the film. Let's just be real. There's not a plot to the film that's just like, oh, it's just so unpredictable and gripping and like it's never been done before. But it's far better as a film, in my opinion, than a lot of films that have never been done before.
Yeah, I mean, like that's where like I think like, I don't know. People always say like the whole like style over substance thing. Like, no, like movies are style. Like, that's the point of movies to me. Like, I'm not a big fan of like message movies in like the traditional sense. Mm-hmm. I think movies should be stylistic. I think that style is like the selling point of movies, right? Like, if like you look at the movie Drive and Baby Driver, they both have the same plot if you write them down, and they're totally different movies because they're totally different movies stylistically. Like, I feel like with Hell or High Water, it's like, yeah, technically, if you wrote the plot in the most like basic way, it's basically like a Western heist Mad Lib style. Like, you just fill in the blanks with different, like, yeah, it's fine. But the style and the way that it's pulled off is what's important. Mm-hmm. And the style is it has this like visceral quality to it. Like, from the beginning, you get like that sort of like thumping, like pulsating score, and you're just like, oh, this is tense already. Yeah. And you get this like really sloppy heist. Like, that's kind of funny. Like, it's kind of they're just kind of bad at it, and it's like that's a tense scene, and that's an entertaining scene. Like, it's moment to moment entertainment and moment to moment conflict that keeps you like pulled through it. Like, I love the sort of unconventional way that the story tells itself. Anyway, like, sort of Tarantino popularized the focusing on elements that most movies don't focus on. Mm-hmm. Like, Pulp Fiction is basically made up of most of the parts of genre movies that are cut out, like the part where they're driving to the hit, the part where they're like he sort of popularized that element of stuff. But after they pull the heist, you then follow them to a casino where they fence the money. Like, they don't normally show that. Like, what's the point? Like, that's an element of it that it makes it feel more real. It makes it feel more relatable, and he still gets entertainment out of it, and he still draws character out of it. And that's what's really impressive to me.
Yeah. And in the previous video talking about Sicario, we spoke about how good Sheridan is at creating relatable conflicts and characters. But I want to go a little bit deeper on that, because I think that it's almost selling a little bit short to say that, it's not this isn't a case of a writer being like, I came up with a engaging conflict that makes sense. It's not that the conflict just makes sense or that it's a relatable situation. It's that the way that he is able to put his finger to the pulse of what characters would do and how they would react, as well as kind of perfectly cast all the characters involved. I have to give a lot of credit to the actors as well. Yeah. To the point where it just always makes sense. It always makes sense. It's always relatable. And there's never a character in a lot of these films that you don't like if they weren't like belligerently like supposed to be evil.
Yeah.
You know, it's like in Sicario, there were no characters that I just hated or thought was the bad guy or needed to die.
Yeah.
Same thing goes for Hell or High Water. I mean, you're cheering. I mean, even in the end, you know, in the confrontation with his brother, played by with Chris Pine's brother in the film, played by Ben Foster, you know, you are not rooting for him to lose, even though he's a belligerent fool. You know, he's crazy. He's unpredictable. He's rude. Probably not a very good guy in general. Yet throughout the film, you are pulled on by Chris Pine being like, you know, he's my brother. I know he's crazy. I know he's stupid. Don't do these things. I'm trying to help him, you know, stay out of prison. But we got to do this thing. But we're also doing this horribly immoral thing. But it's also kind of moral because like everyone hates this bank. And like, you know, that just pulls back, you know, as I bring up the bank element too, it goes back to, well, we're following people that are villains, but they're also not really villains because they're just people trying to get by. And Chris Pine's trying to provide for his family. But then also there are a bunch of hints throughout the film, subtle. They trust the audience to pick it up. They trust you to understand what's going on and make the decision for yourself, that a lot of people seem like they're kind of like, screw that bank.
Yeah.
You know, like it puts you in a situation where it's not easy to say that if you were Chris Pine, you would have done what he would have done. But it's also not easy for you to say, like, how you stupid idiot, you would not do that. Like, why would you not do that? Chris Pine didn't make a bunch of bad decisions in the film.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's a through line of all of these Sheridan films where everything is so well put together in the way that the characters act and the decisions they make. And it's not just the main character. It's the villains too. It's the antagonists or the opposing sides.
For some reason, I noticed some similarities between Taylor Sheridan and Jeff Nichols, even though they're like very different filmmakers, but they both have a very naturalistic Southern style, and especially like Jeff Nichols' first movie, Shotgun Stories. Everything feels very natural, and everything feels very like. It doesn't feel like oh, you're watching a movie. Like I remember Jeff Nichols said about Midnight Special, he was like, I just wanted to do entirely away with exposition. So if it did not naturally come up while I was writing it, it was not written into the dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's great. That's so great, because nobody likes those scenes where they're just like, remember that time 5 years ago? In that May, it was a hot summer. Remember that day when we did? It's like nobody talks like that.
Yeah,
I remember little brother, because you're my little brother. You
That's
know,
my
it's
favorite
just
part
like
of exposition is like when they people call them by names or like say like,
hey sister,
it's been 5 years since the incident where you almost did that thing.
You remember that?
Like, don't you remember?
Don't you remember that? Don't you remember when Mom died 8 years ago? Yeah. Do you remember that? It's like,
or was it? I mean, even we were watching The Woman in the Window, I think there was like a line where someone was like, it's been 10 months since it happened when you separate. Like, it was like, do you think they didn't remember?
It's like, I love when movies I accept that those are just a part of movies.
And it's hard. It is just when you're writing
I get it. And especially, I like the rule of like, do that in the first 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, like if you get it out of the way in the first 30 minutes.
Because like bringing up Woman in the Window, I was really impressed with the way that they gave their exposition through dialogue. And, you know, it's all about doing it slowly, not giving too much and making it make sense. You have to make the situations work.
Yeah.
But the ability to do away with it entirely is
I like when writers trust the audience enough to do away with it entirely and be like, okay, you might not know every single detail of everything going on, but the characters and emotions should be pulling you through.
Yeah.
And I feel like Taylor Sheridan does that really well.
Yeah.
Especially in Hell or High Water.
Yeah. Absolutely. It might be my favorite Sheridan film. So I'm excited to watch Those Who Wish Me Dead, you know, a film that is directed by him. And that's something we're going to move into when we talk about Wind River, is that Sheridan was a writer on Sicario and Hell or High Water, and it worked beautifully. But in the next episode, we're going to talk about Wind River, which was his debut directing? Mm-hmm. So moving from writing to directing, which is a natural path, understandable that you would want to do that. But Wind River is a bit of an overlooked Sheridan film, I would say. So stick around for part 3 of our 3-part series talking about Sheridan's career leading up to the release of his latest film, which we will review and talk about next week